And we are rolling. This is Mark Goldberg with the UN and Global Affairs blog UN Dispatch, speaking with
Beck Hamilton, and we are recording this. We're recording this for the third time, so hopefully this time's actually going to work.
This is true. The first time was about 2.5 weeks ago, and there was some sort of epic malfunction. And the second time was actually about 24 hours ago.
Right.
And there was a second meltdown somewhere on the internet. And so here we are, third time's a charm. Beck, why don't actually you introduce yourself real quick for our podcast listeners out there.
So I am a fellow at the New America Foundation. I also receive grant money from the Pulitzer Center on Crisis Reporting, which is for the Sudan reporting that I do, most recently for the Washington Post. And I'm now the author of a new book called Fighting for Darfur, Public Action and the Struggle to Stop Genocide. And
it's a really good book. I liked it a lot. We'll speak about that book at length during the course of this conversation. But I wanted to maybe get your take on the news of the day on Libya. Your book takes a look at the international response to the crisis in Darfur. It's sort of a story of how the international community succeeded and failed in responding to a mass atrocity. And here we are again, several years later, and we have what we in the business might call a mass atrocity event underway in Libya. And I wanted to maybe just get first your impression of how you think the international community's response has been so far.
I think it's been incredibly different from the response to Darfur because it's been characterized by one thing, which has been the unanimity of the international response. To have had last weekend a unanimous vote of the UN Security Council for sanctions, but also for a referral to the International Criminal Court, it's been really incredible to see.
So that last part, the ICC action, as you said, happened yesterday. So we're recording this on Friday. Yesterday, the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court launched a preliminary investigation, as the Security Council sort of told him to, in their resolution last Saturday. You've actually worked at the ICC. Can you maybe bring us behind the scenes a little bit of what typically would be happening right now?
Yeah, I should say I don't have any inside info right at the moment, but when I was there, there was certainly a sense that with the Darfur referral, the other referral that the ICC has gotten from the UN Security Council, that they didn't have the backing of the world to really move forward. And so it was very much a struggle to operate at the political level to get the support to conduct the investigations. And that's going to be very different this time around at the ICC. So right now what they'll be doing is gathering all the open source information that is out there on what's been happening in Libya as a sort of first pass. And then, the next step is to go a layer deeper and to start to develop inside information about potential crimes against humanity that have been occurring there.
So I made something of a bold prediction on my blog the other day, taking note of this kind of pretty extraordinary unanimity in the international community. And I should say it's not unanimity that's been demonstrated in a number of different ways at different UN forums. So for example, the first UN body to take action on Libya was the Human Rights Council in Geneva. And on Tuesday of last week, or Monday of last week, they passed a resolution that was co-sponsored by scores and scores of different countries from all walks of life. This is the first time probably in UN history that Israel and Palestine co-sponsored a resolution, just to give you a sense of how unified the international community is right now. And then earlier this week, again we're recording this on Friday, so earlier this week, the General Assembly voted to kick Libya out of the Human Rights Council. And that vote was by consensus, meaning unanimous. So, literally every country in the world lined up against Qaddafi and his regime. So based on that kind of unanimity, I made this bold prediction on the blog that, within a year, if he is alive, Qaddafi will be, in the dock in The Hague, either awaiting trial or facing trial. Do you agree? Am I being too optimistic here?
I think that the key part of the phrase that may save you is if he is still alive. I'll be very surprised if he hasn't been killed or perhaps even killed himself before that happens. But I think with that caveat in mind, yes, I think there is a very good chance that that is exactly where he will end up.
So I wanted to, ask you, you've spent a lot of time in Sudan and, reporting for your book and also your work for the Washington Post and other publications. I guess, do you see, this seemingly pan-Arab movement of shaking off these long-sitting autocrats, do you see that sort of heading down south to Sudan? Sudan borders both Egypt and Libya, right? So presumably, the movement might be there, and you spent a lot of time actually working with, or speaking with, or interviewing these opposition groups. I just want to get your kind of general impression on the likelihood of what may happen.
Yeah, what's interesting is that Northern Sudanese are looking at what's been happening in Egypt and saying, well, that's a very Sudanese thing to do, because the Sudanese themselves have overthrown two military dictators in the past, in 64 and in 85, through completely peaceful people's revolutions. And now when Bashir came to power, the current government of Sudan, the National Congress Party, they dismantled the institutions that were fundamental in those previous revolutions, the unions and the sort of professional class. But what you have today that is interesting and one that we should be paying attention to is a new group of youth. The students, they're very well educated and tech savvy, who are looking to what's happening in Egypt and in Libya and thinking that this is possible for us as well. Now, they're organising protests. At the moment, they're persistent, but they're not widespread. There is a factor, though, that could start to change that, which is the economic situation in northern Sudan. Mm-hmm. For the longest time, Bashir has been very comfortable and able to weather all these storms of sanctions and arrest warrants and international condemnation because of a secure economy and, in particular, all the petrodollars coming from the oil revenue in fields that are in southern Sudan. But as Sudan starts to split and that oil revenue, at least part of it, heads southwards, then the northern economy starts to look more shaky. And whether the patronage networks that have enabled Bashir to stay in power so far are able to be maintained is a question. And if they start to get shaky, then could perhaps what the students are trying to do catch on more broadly?
So I guess, would, if this movement catches on, do you think the situation, in Khartoum might resemble more Tripoli or more Tahrir Square, Cairo style?
One fears Tripoli, given what we know of the history of this particular regime.
Right. That kind of almost seems like an obvious answer, considering what they've
done so far.
What they've done so far. You've also spent a lot of time in southern Sudan. Which in July will split. The referendum happened. They voted for independence, and soon they will be their own country, the newest country in the world. And they're receiving a lot of international support, particularly from the United States and from the international donor community in general. Like, people seem to want this new country of South Sudan to succeed. Mm-hmm. But, I wonder, if we're being realistic here. It's sad to say, but it's a country that does not have a lot sort of going for it, it would seem. Its economy would be based almost exclusively on the export of oil, which we know is sort of a problematic thing for a country. It's landlocked, which is also, an impediment to economic development more broadly. It itself has a history of violence. Its neighbors are also fairly violent. How worried should we be that this new country is going to be, the newest international basket case?
We've got to be really worried, and that is not to diminish the incredible moment that was January, with all of southern Sudan coming together to vote for independence. But as you say, the realities are very, very tough. desperate lack of infrastructure. 85% of the population are illiterate. And this government that was a rebel group until just 6 years ago. And what they have are enormous expectations from the citizens of the soon-to-be new country. When you travel in the South and you speak to people in rural areas, they will consistently say that in voting for independence, it's not that they're voting just for some ideal of nationhood, but for very specific things that will make a difference in daily lives. They expect that there will be hospitals, that there will be schools, that there will be electricity and clean water. And how long are they going to wait for the government to be able to deliver those services? If people feel that independence is not giving them the sorts of changes in their daily lives that they were expecting, that's when the risk comes in. Because as you say, the South itself, notwithstanding this moment of unity in January to vote for independence, the South itself is actually very, very divided along lots of different ethnic lines. And during the North-South Civil War, there was an internal Southern war with lots of different rebel groups, mostly coalesced around ethnic lines. And as much as there's been an attempt at disarmament over the period that this peace agreement has been in place, there are still very, very many arms across all of Southern Sudan. So, yes, enormous risks for this project of this new nation.
I wanted to talk about your book a bit. I really liked your book. As I read it, your book sort of did, three sort of main things. First, it told the narrative political story of how, the political class here in Washington and around the world responded to this unfolding crisis in Darfur, how policy was developed, and it analyzed, where policy succeeded, where policies failed. But then it sort of took the story a step further and examined the rise of this Save Darfur movement and how the advent of this movement, how the movement was able to influence policy at key discrete points, sometimes for better, you argue, sometimes for worse. I wanted to maybe just, ask you, your general sort of takeaway. How do you think the Save Darfur movement fared? Did it push U.S. policy in the right direction, international policy in the right direction? What's your I guess, top-line assessment?
Yeah, I think that the biggest impact that it had was on the U.S. political system, as opposed to Darfuri lives, which should have been the major metric of success. Now, that's not to say that there were no successes in terms of what it did for Darfuris themselves. And the one that is the sort of unequivocal, easy one to highlight is the extent to which the movement was able to get funding appropriated out of Congress, $2 billion between 2005 and 2008. That was second only to Iraq and Afghanistan. And tenfold more than any other country in Africa. And that really did translate into lives saved, because at the point that we're talking about, most of the Darfuri population that had managed to survive the initial attacks were in these displaced camps and were dependent on humanitarian aid. And that aid was funded in large part by these congressional appropriations. So that's the success part of the story. Much of everything else that the movement was trying to do within the US system ended up being not nearly as effective as people hoped, in large part because Washington just didn't have as much leverage as everyone imagined it had over Khartoum. If you really took a hard look at the basic leverage calculation, you saw that the US had already implemented almost total economic sanctions and diplomatic sanctions against Sudan back in the 1990s. It had already listed it as a state sponsor of terror for its hosting of Osama bin Laden. There wasn't really very much else that the US could do in terms of sticks. It wasn't about to invade a third Muslim country, and it would have been a bad idea if it had. So all that it really had left in terms of leverage was to promise Khartoum a normalization of relations, that we would return an ambassador to Sudan, that we would perhaps consider lifting economic sanctions. Now, those are not things that an advocacy community rallying against a genocidal regime in Khartoum was going to stand by and let happen. So you had them pushing the US government to come out with very strident public messages. And I think one of the things that we learn from this about the nature of a mass movement is that it's very good for some things. It is good for directing the attention of the government. It's good for congressional appropriations. It's good for getting hardline rhetoric out of the US government, persistently calling it genocide. What it's not as good at is when the policy needs to focus on behind-the-scenes diplomacy and negotiation. That's a hard thing for a mass movement to push for.
This dynamic with Congress that you describe just now and in your book, it's something that I kind of witnessed, firsthand when I was reporting on these issues, for the last, since like 2005 on.
Right.
I'd go to these hearings at like the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and you'd have, one of the many Sudan envoys that the Bush administration appointed, or the Sudan envoy that the Obama administration appointed, and they'd be testifying before Congress. And, these are the guys that have to do the actual, negotiating and talking to the regime in Khartoum, and they would try so hard not to call it genocide and try so hard to offer maybe some conciliatory notes about the regime in Khartoum, and as soon as they did that, they would just get berated by members of Congress. And this, I think, is testimony to the the effectiveness of the lobbying effort of the movement. But it created this kind of almost weird dynamic where it was like ritualistic almost. You would see these envoys come up before Congress, sit uncomfortably, and have to maybe, say there's a genocide, say there's not a genocide, not really answer that question straight, and then get yelled at by a member of Congress.
Right, absolutely. And, the other interesting thing about that from the book is the extent to which Khartoum was watching that play out. Not only was it seeing what the various US diplomats were saying, but it was also getting a read from Congress and from the strong pushback that Congress was giving on what the domestic political situation was in the US. And it made Khartoum very wary of any promise that various US diplomats tried to make of the normalization of relations, because it was pretty clear that in a domestic political sense that wasn't going to fly in the US.
Another thing I wanted to ask you about in your book is this idea that so you demonstrate very clearly the Save Darfur movement came too late to save Darfur, right? It's the scope of the killings, the genocidal killings that we would all recognize as genocide or mass atrocities.
In terms of stopping the deaths from direct violence, it was too late.
Right. And because most of that direct violence happened in like 2004 or 2003. But the movement really didn't get off the ground until about 2005, 2006. We had a mass rally here in D.C. in 2006, with speakers. I think then Senator Obama was one of the speakers at the rally.
Absolutely.
And so, you could argue it was too late, to stop the genocide that had happened 3 years ago. But, one argument I'd make, and that, you can disagree with me on, is that it came about almost just in time to stop what many people expect, again, a repeat of Darfur, but in South Sudan, that in the run-up to this referendum, for independence, that the North would once again unleash its the similar strategies that it did to quell this counterinsurgency in Darfur in the South, but we didn't see that kind of mass violence. And one of the reasons I'd argue that we didn't see it is because this movement had sort of matured at that point, and had sort of kept top-level administration attention on the situation in South Sudan in the lead-up to the referendum.
Yeah, I think that there's something to that. It's interesting that you one of the things about writing the book at this moment is that we can look at what are the immediate impacts in Darfur, but we can't really assess what will be the future impact of having had this experience of advocacy. One of the things that I think it has done is pushed back against the sort of assumption that has been there for decades, that there is no one out there in the American public that actually cares about mass atrocity crimes against foreigners in a distant land. And it pushed back against this very, very strongly. And I think you probably can't underestimate what is the formative impact on someone like Obama, who was a senator at the time that the Save Darfur movement was really in full swing, and getting all those calls in his offices, getting graded on how he was responding to Darfur, getting a very clear message that there were people out there amongst the American populace that cared about these kinds of issues. And I think that helps when you are moving forward and looking at other situations. What I would say, though, is that in all the attention that we gave to Darfur, we really missed out on implementing very key provisions within the North-South peace agreement. And yes, it's great that the very last provision in there, that the referendum happened in January 2011, that finally everyone scrambled and managed to meet that. That's a success. But what got lost along the way were all the other benchmarks for places like Abyei, that their referendum didn't get held. And we're seeing the consequences of that with these continual outbreaks of violence at the moment.
And Abyei is sort of a disputed region between North and South, and with some oil, and is contested. I guess though. So just to keep on this question is so. All right. So arguably the administration. Now we're talking about the Obama administration traded the national elections in Sudan, which were called for in the peace agreement, for an independence referendum.
I think that's right.
And I think that it would seem to be the case that they did that.
Yeah.
But at least, and this was, I guess, to the chagrin of the movement, right?
Yeah, I'm not sure that the movement was even. I mean, they were somewhat engaged in the democratic elections. I think it was probably by the time of the proposed national elections, I think the Darfur advocacy community has started to realize that there was a mistake to only focus on Darfur and ignore what was happening in the rest of Sudan. Mm-hmm. And so they started to shift to get behind the elections. But they just couldn't convince the administration on this one. And I think the administration made the calculation that of the very, very many things going on in Sudan, if the referendum didn't happen, that was the one that could reignite a civil war, and that Bashir was the person that they at least had some sense of how they could push to get the referendum happening. Whereas if you'd had a truly democratic election, then who knows who you would have had in power. But it wasn't just, in any case, about having a free and fair voting process. You would have had to have changed a whole lot of other factors. Reform of the media law, reform of the national security law, freedom for opposition groups to organise. All of those things would have had to have been implemented before you held an election. And those things had also been lost, and arguably were lost by the time the Obama administration even came in.
I wanted to turn to something I found, particularly, interesting in your book, which was this question of China and how to influence China, right? So the United States does not, and it never really had much influence over the regime in Khartoum. For part of the reason for the reasons that you explained, that there was no opportunity to engage Khartoum because it just wasn't domestically politically possible. But the one country that does wield significant leverage over Sudan is China. And, typically you would expect that China not to really care too much about these kind of human rights issues. But you tell the story about how activists were able to, change the equation on China. I'll let you maybe explain the story, because I think it's pretty interesting and has good lessons for how one might engage China in the future on these questions.
It's also the one bright chapter in what is otherwise quite a depressing book. What happened was that the sort of founding wisdom of the Darfur advocacy movement was a lesson that had been taken after the genocide in Rwanda and the U.S. failure to stop it. It was essentially this, that if the American public creates an outcry, then they will pressure the U.S. government. If you get political will within the U.S. government system, then the U.S. government will act and be able to save lives. So for the first years of the movement, you had advocates focused almost exclusively on pushing the U.S. government. And then in 2007, what you had was a sort of a breakaway, if you like, of a group who thought, no, actually it looks like the biggest source of leverage comes not from Washington but from Beijing. And the campaign that they started wasn't grounded on any assumption that you could actually get China to care about human rights in Darfur. It was that there was a window of opportunity in the build-up to the 2008 Beijing Olympics where you did have something that China cared very much about, which was its image in the build-up to the Olympic Games. And that was something that you could do a name and shame campaign around. And it sort of throws out the conventional wisdom on how you move Chinese foreign policy as well, because if you talk to any China expert, they will tell you the only way that you can get Beijing to move is quietly, gently, behind the scenes, very respectful. And this flew in the face of all of that. It was a public shaming campaign, but it was effective because it got at something that China actually cared about. And so within 2 days of launching the campaign, China had appointed a special envoy on Darfur, something that they hadn't done before. Now, that in and of itself doesn't necessarily indicate a policy change. I think perhaps one of the ways we should start looking at special envoys is a response to advocacy. They're showing that they're paying attention. But you did subsequently see a policy shift, which was in 2006, China had abstained from supporting the UN Security Council resolution to get peacekeepers into Darfur. And when that happened, Khartoum read that accurately as saying that they didn't actually need to follow through and allow the implementation because China would stand beside it if it pushed back against those peacekeepers going in. A year later, in the midst of this Genocide Olympics campaign, China actually voted for what was, in the sense of mandate, a virtually identical resolution to get peacekeepers into Darfur. And so you see that policy shift, and then you pull it together with speaking to people at the UN Security Council, all of the people working on these resolutions. And they will say, without hesitation, when you ask them what accounted for the shift, they'll say it was the Olympics campaign.
See, that's so interesting because, and it speaks, I guess, to a larger question about how, how to approach, mass atrocities in general, around the world. I mean, chances are, the next place that a mass atrocity occurs, let's bracket Libya aside, will be in a country that China has more influence over than the United States, places like Burma or Sri Lanka. And, you wonder, was this, a one-time event that only, was China moving on this only due to this one-time event around the Olympics, or could something like that be repeated in the future?
Look, I think that opportunities like the Olympics are pretty rare, but I think it's worth advocates in the future on any number of issues, not even just mass atrocity crimes, that are wanting to push China to look for these moments where there is something that's in China's national interest that people in the West can get at. In that sense, it could be a model.
So I want to maybe finally ask you, this book is really, very deeply reported, very well researched. and I can tell these things because I was reporting on a lot of these issues at the time, and you go way deeper and are really, a lot of interviews, a lot of reports. What, I guess, surprised you the most when you were reporting this? What did you just totally not expect that came up and took you aback?
I guess that there's two things. The first thing to say is just how pervasive the lessons of Rwanda were on how the Darfur story unfolded. And there's a bigger lesson there about how we think about using lessons from history, and a real need to ensure that whilst it's important to do a lessons learned exercise, and this book is in many ways one of them, that we don't just cut and paste those lessons, and that we really update them for context. But in terms of reconstructing the policy process, the moment that I think was most shocking to me came relatively early on in the research. And it was over how it was that Colin Powell made his genocide determination. Firstly, that the legal advice that he was given was, you can argue it one way or you can argue it the other. Not unequivocally the only thing that you can call this is genocide. It basically came down to a judgment call by Powell. But the other and more even sobering part of this is just how little buy-in there was from the rest of the US government for him to make this determination. In fact, he had consulted within the State Department, but had in fact only gone to see the president 2 days before he made his determination. So he stood before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee on Thursday, September 9th. He went to see President Bush on the Tuesday. By the way, on Thursday I'll be calling this genocide, at which point Bush said to Condoleezza Rice, you better let the other principals know so the other agencies won't be surprised. So in no sense was this ever a whole of US government commitment to do something. And in that context, I asked Powell, well, why then go ahead and make the genocide determination? And he says that he hoped that the use of the word genocide would push other countries on the UN Security Council to act. Now, this was coming at a time, 18 months after he had said that there were weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. So it had exactly the opposite impact on other countries in the Security Council. What it did, though, was build really this US-based advocacy movement that turned around and pushed straight back at the US government. So in many ways backfired from exactly what he was hoping.
I guess it's fascinating to me that Powell could even think that. I'm thinking back to that. I guess it was September 2004 Senate Foreign Relations Committee hearing where Powell said, Darfur is a genocide, and I'll paraphrase, but I think the very next sentence thereafter was, but that doesn't mean we have to do anything about it. Right. And how he could think that, saying we don't think that means we have to do anything about it will somehow inspire other countries to do something about it is
right.
sort of beyond me.
That's true, although I think he was probably focused on how powerful just the usherance of the word genocide could be. And, there's something to that. For the longest time, we've been caught up in this sense that it is, something has to be called genocide before it's really worthy of public action and mobilization. And I hope that, one of the lessons that we get to beyond Darfur is that you don't have to label a situation genocide for it to be important to act on. In fact, there are many very serious crimes out there that just happen not to fit within the very narrow legal definition that is genocide. And no.
I wonder, on this point of the Powell Declaration, how much did sort of domestic political influences factor in? September 2004 was 2 months before, Bush's midterm election, right? And there was a constituency focused on Sudan at that point. There was no sort of Save Darfur movement, but a lot of evangelicals, members of presumably of Bush's base, were pretty keenly focused on this issue because of their long-standing association with the southern Sudanese, who are predominantly Christian. Was there any? I mean, do you get a sense that sort of kind of domestic political consideration was a factor at all?
I could never get anyone to admit that. That doesn't mean that it wasn't there. And I think, the other thing is you had over the summer before Powell made his determination on behalf of the executive branch, you had Congress coming out and calling it genocide, Republican-controlled Congress. And so there was a political signal there too. Now, as you say, there was no real Darfur advocacy movement yet. So in that sense, I don't think that they were responding to advocacy in doing it. You're right that there were the Southern Sudanese advocates, and that was probably how you got that determination out of Congress. But I think it may have been more like, well, we could call it or we could not, and it's probably safer to call it genocide for fear of somebody accusing us of doing what the Clinton administration did during Rwanda.
I guess so. Maybe this will be the last question. So you kind of described your book earlier as a lessons learned process. I guess what could have the United States done, if anything, to stop this genocide? Where did the United States and the international community drop the ball?
There are so many points along the way, so it's sort of a hard question to answer in a single soundbite.
No need for a soundbite. Dig right in.
So if you go back to 2003, the worst massacres that Darfur had ever seen. And at that time, there were people within the US government raising the alarm on it and being told not to rock the boat because the North-South peace agreement needed to be finished. And so you had the government making a very conscious decision to prioritize Southern Sudan and peace in Southern Sudan over what was happening in Darfur. That early point would have been the point to really engage, and it's always easier if you get in early in a conflict. Today we have, 15 different rebel factions growing by the day, and very difficult to pull together a peace agreement with that amount. Back in 2003, you had just 2. So early engagement would have helped, and if you go back then, it would have been before the time that Iraq really became the quagmire that it subsequently did, and the US did still have some leverage left by the ability to threaten the use of force. Now, I don't think actually using force would have been a good idea, but it might have been nice to have had the stick to bring to the negotiating table if you had decided to really prioritize Darfur at that point instead of making it subservient to what was happening between North and South. And so it was a very belated move over towards Darfur, and by the time they got there, their leverage really was pretty limited. That said, had it ever been a real top foreign policy priority, then they could have pushed their bilateral relationships with other countries, and in particular China, to get movement rather than relying on a public advocacy shaming campaign to get China to move. So that was another possibility. But as much as the Darfur advocacy movement gained strength, it was never strong enough to top conventional national interests. So whenever the US was talking to China, number 1 and number 2 on the talking points were North Korea and currency revaluation. And Darfur came down sort of 3rd or 4th, which meant from the perspective of Beijing, well, we can let it slide. But, the tragedy, I guess, of this first, in many ways, inspirational effort by citizens to stop mass atrocity crimes was so overly directed towards the US government at a time that the US government was not the best positioned to act on this. And there will be some cases in the future where the US government is the best positioned to act. Coming up, I think it has an enormous amount of leverage over the new government of South Sudan. But there will be other times that it doesn't. We are in a multipolar world, and I think that part of the lesson for the future is to really do some serious scrutiny of who has the leverage, and if you're going to start an advocacy campaign, what is your theory of change? Are you going to get that right at the beginning before you go forward? And don't just assume that because the lesson from Rwanda was, the American public have to create an outcry and the U.S. government has to act, that is the right lesson for all future situations of mass atrocity.
Great. Well, Beck, thank you so much. Let's hope third time's a charm.
Yeah, and thank you so much for spending so much time talking to me over the last couple of weeks. It was wonderful. And for the viewer's sake, some of the questions were ones that we had spoken, and some of the bits of the conversation that we spoke about were ones that we had spoken about a couple times earlier in our other aborted attempts. But that's true. But you sprung some new ones on me.
I want to keep you on your toes, so there are a few new questions thrown in there.
All right. Thanks very much,
All
Mark.
right. Thank you.